Namaste. Today we shall discuss the topic subject called object. Subject and object are two very important and significant terms in psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, even spirituality, and modern research on psyche and spirituality. For this topic, we have our psychoanalysis consultant, Mr. Himanshu Vaidya, with us. Mr. Himanshu, can we start with explaining these two terms and their significance in psychoanalysis?
Yes, the two words subject and object in everyday language mean something very simple. Subject refers to an area of knowledge. You will hear students talk about, I have to study 6 chapters in this subject. And by object, people mean anything which does not have life. So it is not a human being, not a plant, not a tree, not an animal. Something inanimate like this table or this laptop, in normal language we call them as objects. This is the normal way in which we use these two words, subject and object. In psychoanalysis, we use these two words very differently. So, if I am looking at this laptop, psychoanalytically speaking, I am the subject and the laptop is the object.
Right.
If I am looking at you, I am the subject, you are the object. So the word object includes in psychoanalysis anything that the mind focuses upon. And the word object is used in a very respectful way. When we say that when I am looking at you, I am the subject and you are the object. Similarly, when you are looking at me and thinking about me, I am the object and you are the subject. So when we use the word object, we use it very respectfully. The idea is not to dehumanize a person and put him at the same level like a lifeless thing. That is not the idea at all. But we look at the word object as being that entity on which the mind is focusing in some way. So the whole universe there gets divided into two parts, the mind and that entity on which the mind focuses. The mind therefore becomes a subject and every other entity becomes the object. This leads to another aspect, another situation when we are dealing with entities that don't exist in the real world and our fantasy and our dreams have created those entities. So I can dream about some person who does not exist in reality. That person's image in my mind, that entity in my mind, although it is a fantasy created entity, that is also a psychological object. Although in reality it has no existence, it is created by my dreams or by my fantasies, still it is a psychological object. Even more subtle, at even more subtle levels, when I start thinking about myself, what kind of person I am, then a part of me is thinking about all that I know about myself and evaluate that. So in that case, the part of me which is thinking about myself becomes a subject, and all that I know about myself, the data upon which I am applying my thought to evaluate myself, that becomes the object. The object can also be something which I saw or I created in fantasy before language started. It can also be a pre-verbal object. And it is very difficult to verbalize or know for certain what it was or how I felt about it. So the pre-verbal objects also are objects. You also have fantasy objects of very early life before I and not I are clearly established. So in that oceanic state, before I and not I are established, you still have objects and you still have subject, although it is one oceanic whole, and we do not have interpersonal object and subject, but within the person, within that oceanic whole, we still have the subject and the object. Many people in the Kleinian view also believe that we all have a self-image of ourselves in our mental world, and therefore the self is also an object, a special kind of object which tries to know other objects, and we call this object as subject, but this also shares many of the characteristics of the object. So the subject, when we look at the subject as an object, the subject does not come out to be totally distinct from the object it is trying to study, interact with, or manage. So this is how the whole gamut of meanings of the two words subject and object come up in psychoanalysis.
This brings us a lot of clarity about these two terms. So the next question is it possible to experience object-free states of the psyche, keeping the modern research in mind?
This requires some background because this is a slightly complicated question. This gets us into the controversy between Freud and Klein on a particular topic of existence of primary narcissism. We will start from this and then we will take a detour into the Indian spirituality to answer this question. Freud had theorized that we all start off with a state of primary narcissism. And in that state, we don't have any recognition of any entity called the object. It is an object-free state. You experience just one oceanic whole, and it is one where there is no other, neither outside nor inside. It is just one. And in that state, often you have the feeling of intense bliss. And Freud also used to say that what is called nirvana or enlightenment in the Eastern tradition is actually a return to this state of primary narcissism. Which of course I don't think is true. I think this state actually gives us a taste of enlightenment. It is a proto-state, a pre-state, right, which develops in a very different way in what we call enlightenment. But yes, the two states of primary narcissism and enlightenment do share the feeling of oneness and the feeling of bliss. What they don't share is the feeling of self-awareness, the existence of self-awareness, a very high level of self-awareness in enlightenment, whereas that thing is absent in primary narcissism. But Freud conceptualized this and he said, we pass through this stage of primary narcissism after we are born. And after some time, which he was not very clear about, whether it is 2 weeks or 1 month or 2 months, but after some time, we start recognizing objects. And therefore, in some sense, the other comes into existence. Whether that the other is in the outside world, after I and not I are established, or the other is in the inside world, when we are still in that oceanic whole, before I and not I are established. In either of the cases, Freud conceptualized a state of primary narcissism, which was an object-free state. And then we get into an object state, and then we get into a I not I state, where the not I is the part object, and then we get into a I and not I, where not I is a full person. So this is the way our journey is in Freudian conceptualization, from a no object state to a oceanic object state to a part object state in the outside world to a full object state in the outside world. Klein had a different view on this. Klein said that we are essentially object relations creatures, and therefore the state of primary narcissism does not exist. The moment we are born, we are continuously relating with the objects, whether it is in the oceanic state or it is in the I not, after I not I, it is in the part object state or the full object state. But we are always in object relations mode. Modern research done on infants using video cameras and many of the experimental techniques, they have started siding more with Klein rather than Freud. That it seems as though the object relations starts very early, almost immediately after birth. And this is where the empirical position right now is, that people believe Klein was more right than Freud, and maybe we don't have a state of primary narcissism. And therefore, we don't experience, really speaking, any time in our lives, an object-free state. I have a lot of differences with this empirical finding. I personally believe very strongly that a state of primary narcissism does exist. How and where may be a question. Maybe that state is intrauterine. Maybe that state is when we go to sleep inside the uterus, or maybe that state is when we go to sleep after being born, or maybe there are in between phases when we experience those states. But I can't believe that the state of primary narcissism does not exist. The reasons are the following. One, I have experienced myself certain spiritual states, and I know that the same states were experienced by me before without knowing the word primary narcissism. So the state of no thought that I have experienced personally, accompanied by awareness and bliss at a shorter duration, of course, that state had a proto-state in many types of states that I experienced before. So the proto-state of that state I have experienced many times before, and it resembles very near, very strongly to the state of primary narcissism. Second, I see people regressing in adult age to the state of primary narcissism. Third, even in case of extreme pleasures, after the pleasure is over, often you see regression to the state of primary narcissism. Fourth, we see this in patients, that we see in adult stage a regression to the state of primary narcissism, partially or totally. Mostly it is partially. Therefore, despite the empirical finding, I do believe that the state of primary narcissism does exist, and future research will modify the current findings. This is with respect to the Western psychotherapy conceptualization. In the Eastern tradition, we have description of two different states. One state is a state of no thought and pure awareness, where you don't have any objects. And this state is prescribed as a goal state in many spiritual schools. And therefore, in the Eastern view of things, it is very much possible to experience a state of psyche without any object. An object-free state is very much possible to experience. One state is what I just referred to, the state of awareness, no thought and bliss. The second psychological state that the Eastern tradition talks about is the state of oneness with existence. And Swami Yogananda Paramahansa defines it very well. He says about that state, center everywhere, circumference nowhere. And that identity with existence, with the whole universe, that again is an object-free state, not because objects don't exist, but because a subject does not exist. And it's a very different conceptualization of the subject-object dynamic. In the West, just as in primary narcissism, we have an object-free state. In the East, the spiritual states that we are referring to, the state of no thought, the state of oneness with existence, the state of just pure awareness, many of the spiritual states are described and have been experienced by many people. Some of them are still living. And these are the states which tell us that although not common, it is rare, but it is possible to experience object-free states. This also brings us to the next question, which is a part of this question. Can you experience pure affect? Now, this again brings up the idea of subject and object. Because in the object relations theory, the affect moves towards an object. If the object is not in the external world, we create fantasy objects. But there is no conceptualization of a free affect where there is no object. But I think, not only I think, I know, because I have felt personally, experienced personally, pure affect. And how can one experience pure affect? How do we know that it exists? Rather, how do I know that it exists? The sequence goes like this. Let us say you are envious about 5 objects, which means the envy inside is going towards these 5 objects. You start working upon yourself and you overcome envy towards 4 of these objects. So the envy collapses into the reservoir back. And out of the whole reservoir, only one part is now attached to object 1. All other object envies you have worked upon, and the envy has been freed from there. So if we conceptualize hypothetically that part of the envy was erased and part of it has collapsed back into the reservoir, then what happens is, when you work upon yourself adequately so that you have removed negative affects towards most of the objects, and the negative affect which is now freed from those objects, part of it, let us say, gets erased and part of it goes back to the reservoir. When that happens and very few objects are left, this potential reservoir out of which objects used to activate certain things and make this potential kinetic, this reservoir of energy, when it becomes large enough, free from objects, you can see it and experience it as pure affect. A pure affect free of objects. And this is something we have to deal with, and it is a difficult thing to deal with, because of which, in the first place, unconsciously the psyche keeps deflecting this pure affect onto objects. Otherwise, it would come on ourselves. So when we free any negative affect from an object, the entanglement with an object, part of it can get erased and part of it falls back. And that which falls back, if does not get any other object and cannot be successfully converted into a potential form, it comes back upon us. So that, having experienced myself, I realize that it is possible to experience pure affect without any object, just as it is possible to experience an object-free state. So it is possible to experience an object-free state. It is possible to experience a pure affect state. And the two can be experienced separately or together. You can go into an object-free state without experiencing pure affect, or you can go into an object-free state and experience pure affect.
Thank you so much for this wonderful clarity. So my next question is the subject always an object in the representational world?
In the objects relations theory, yes. The self or the subject is also seen as one of the objects in that entire object world inside our minds. They call it the representational world. So the idea is everything outside is represented inside in the form of an object. And our self...
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is representational world and phenomenological world the same thing, or is there a difference? Because these two terms are used in psychoanalysis, in the field of psychology. Just for clarification.
Yeah, the two terms actually come from different areas. The phenomenological world, the word phenomenological is used generally in philosophy, because there is a school of philosophy which is called phenomenology. And the idea there is that we come to know about something because of a psychological phenomena. That I see something, the light from that thing falls on my eyes, the fragrance from that comes into my nostrils, I can touch it, and all this data is accumulated, coordinated, synthesized to make in my mind the image of that object. And we can know only something by a phenomena. We cannot know the thing in itself. So if all my senses are taken away, I cannot know what that thing is. So I know that thing only when I and that thing enter into a phenomena. So the philosophy debate was, can we know something in its absolute eternal truth? The thing in itself. And the answer to that by phenomenology school is that we cannot. We know only all that is possible in the phenomenological world. We can only speculate what would be before it, after it, or inside it, or above it. And that would include our own minds. That the part of the mind, if at all it is there and not involved in phenomena, it would be difficult to know. So the representational world is used in psychology, and it is created out of phenomena. So in the phenomenological realm, lot of things get created. One thing which is created is a representational world inside our minds. So in that vast canvas of the phenomenological universe, one event is creation of the representational world in our mind out of phenomena happening inside our minds. Coming to the question, what was the question?
Should I repeat the question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Is the subject always an object in the representational world?
Yes, yes. In the object relations worldview, yes. That everything that we know of, everything that we psychologically operate upon or engage with, essentially is a psychological object. In that sense, the self or ourselves as we see it is also represented in that representational world by an object called the self. So the subject also in a sense is an object, maybe a master object from a vantage point standpoint, but still an object. Another way of looking at it also is not to look at ourselves as a whole as a self object, but have a self object and also parts of ourselves as objects. For example, a self object and related to the self object or parts of the self object, let us say ego. And the narcissistic phenomena in the object relations theory would be that the omnipotence is invested into the ego and the ego blows up, becomes grandiose. So the omnipotence, instead of being repressed or projected, is associated with ego. So the ego identifies with that omnipotent object and becomes one and becomes grandiose. So that conceptualization will lead us to a situation where we look at self as a larger object with smaller objects which are its constituents. And there is inside the self a dynamism of what happens to each of these part objects. So because of things inside, something can happen. Because of something from outside, it can happen. And outside meaning the outside in the inside. Outside in the representational world inside. So this is how the classical object relations theory talks about that the subject is also seen as an object, a special kind of object, but still an object. Now, the difficulty arises when we try to explain the spiritual experiences of the East with this kind of a model. Because when we look at the state of pure awareness, then there is nothing, it's a state of no thought, no object is seen. When you enter the state of no thought, there is no thought or affect towards any object, the mind is blank, there is only awareness. So in that sense, we don't feel in that experience that the self is an object working on other objects. It's a very different kind of a state in which we don't feel either the self is an object, we also don't realize there are any other objects in the mind, any psychological activity in terms of thinking or feeling is happening. Also the state of oneness with everyone, we see almost a loss of subject. And when the subject is lost in that experience, there is no question of self also as an object existing in the representational world. The self as an object almost dissolves into a pure awareness. And in the state of no thought, we see no object and only awareness. In the state of oneness with existence, we see objects but without a subject. In both cases, the self as an object is practically absent.
Right.
At least in the sense that the Kleinians or the representational world theories or the object relations theories talk about. So it is possible for a subject not to be an object and to be something quite different from what is conceptualized either as object or as self-object. It's a different state which requires different kind of concepts, and our present object relations conceptualization is not able to explain or reach the states that we are referring to.
Right. Okay. Now, how to deal with a subject who is desperately trying for a good, reliable, stable object?
Now, this is a central question for psychotherapy. The quest of a good, reliable, stable object. And the problem there is that a good, reliable, stable object could not be internalized, nor could part of that good, reliable, stable object be made one with the subject by identification. So the subject is standing helpless and powerless in absence of that object, because that's the health and the power of the subject, the happiness and the initiative and the uh, project seeking and the success of the subject depends on a cohabiting good, reliable, stable object. That being missing, the subject feels unhealthy, depressed, and without energy or strength. So this brings out the dependence of the subject on very certain special kinds of objects, which means all objects in the representational world are not equal. There are some which are special. There are some which can be internalized only at particular times in our lives. There are some on which the subject depends heavily. There are some on which the subject does not depend at all. So the world of objects is a very heterogeneous world. And the relation of the subject to the object is also very heterogeneous. In case where the subject is desperately looking out for a good, reliable, stable object, first is we should feel optimistic and good that the subject has still not given up the quest of the object. The subject is still optimistic and happy. He has not given down. He has not thrown his arms. So first we should feel happy about the optimism. 2, how to facilitate it? The best is to find a good, reliable, stable object in the environment, which is difficult because it's not easy to find a good, reliable, stable object. It is also not easy to have that good, reliable, stable object available to us for a long time, without which internalization cannot happen. Internalization cannot happen in 1 or 2 meetings. It also cannot happen by will, that I take photograph of somebody and I say I want to internalize. So the internalization process is such a psychological process. It requires what is called contiguity and presence. Similarity and contiguity, that the object has to be very near to the ideal good, reliable, stable object, and the object has to be in front of me for an extended period of time. Unless these two are established, it's not easy to internalize a good, reliable, stable object. It cannot be done by will. It's not a conscious mind's activity. Therefore, if we find such good father figures, mother figures, mentors, old wise men around us, we should spend as much time as possible with them. And if we find somebody else whom we want to help, we should get the person connected to such people and try to do our best that the two spend considerable time together. If that cannot happen in the real world, the next way out is therapy. That in therapy, the therapist is seen as a good, reliable, stable object and internalized over a period of time. So if we are meeting the therapist twice or thrice a week for an extended period of time, automatically this happens. The difficulty is if therapy takes the form it takes today because of time, that we are having a therapy model today where it's once a week for 6 months or once a week for 3 months, that is not adequate to internalize a good, reliable, stable object. We also have to help the person to let go the inhibition to attachment. Because most people who are desperately need a good, reliable, stable object also have the highest inhibition to attach to somebody and allow that internalization. So those who need it most are the ones, those who run away from it most. So that inhibition to attach without the, so that movement to attach without any inhibition with full force, without the fear of exploitation, persecution or abandonment. So in therapy, those things have to be taken out first so that the person is ready to let go templates of never again, let go templates of always be on guard, the templates of what he will also do the same. So unless those templates are taken care of in therapy, even in long therapy, it is not easy for the person who has not internalized a good, reliable, stable object in early life to now get ready to do so. So that is the part of therapy. In terms of Eastern healing, idle therapy visualization is a very good way of looking at it, which we have not used scientifically enough. That if through a human interaction it is not possible, then can you do the same by interacting with an idol? The idol is not just a stone idol or a wood idol or a paper idol. It is a personality because stories are woven around it. And it has got a human persona, maybe exaggerated, maybe divinized, but still an anthropomorphic persona. And that allows us another option to facilitate for us or somebody who needs it an internalization of good, reliable, stable object. So a subject looking out for a good, reliable, stable object, these are some of the safe, scientific and profoundly thought out ways. If we don't provide these avenues, more likely the person will be stumbling from one object to another in his desperate search, paying a very high price for it.
How far can one go philosophically, operating thought on the object?
This is a difficult question because this brings in 3 or 4 different situations. We will have to start with the theory of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant understood, or rather propounded, a process description of how knowledge happens. So he says, when I look at any object, the light from the object, the sound from the object, the fragrance from the object, the touch of the object, all senses get data and put them together, and mind registers that yes, the senses have encountered stimulus. So the stimulus from all the senses gets converted into a sensation when recognized by the mind. Otherwise, it is just stimulus. It's like if you put a stimulus on a dead man's hand, the stimulus is there, but there is no one to register a sensation. So there has to be a alive apparatus inside, an alive mind inside to register the stimulus as a sensation. So the stimulus comes from hundreds of nerves. If I touch something, all the fingers are touching. And nerves from all the fingers are getting sensation about the stimulus, about the same thing. All this stimuli has to be coordinated into one sensation. So at the same time, I can see partly I can see the desktop, partly I can see the cupboard. And hundreds of light rays are coming from both. But there is somebody inside who is putting them into a folder. All light rays coming from the desktop into one folder, all those coming from the cupboard into a second folder. There's no confusion. So there is somebody inside, a mechanism which is converting stimuli into a sensation. So this is the first stage according to Kant. Sensations from all the senses are put together and we get a fair picture of the object. He calls it perception. Then on the perception, we start applying our knowledge and memory and science and everything. We get into conception. Then we process it further, we get into knowledge and then into wisdom. So this is how stage by stage, the stimulus slowly goes into sensation, perception, conception, knowledge and wisdom. Now, he said that there is no way we can know something by jumping over this process. We cannot have knowledge by jumping over the phenomena of acquiring knowledge. And therefore, all that we know about the external world is whatever we have reported and whatever has been reported and analyzed. If something our senses are incapable of reporting, we would be living immersed in that entity but still not know about it. And that is true about many frequency of radio waves, that they may be going across us but we cannot register them. So regardless of how much that entity is around us or inside us, we cannot know it because we don't have the apparatus to know it. So the first limitation we put upon thought was that thought can only go so far as the sensory apparatus allows us. What that other thing is into itself, before it came in touch with our sensory apparatus, that is something we can never know. Similarly, inside of us, if certain faculties are missing to process a particular kind of data, that also we cannot know. So we can never know what is the thing in itself. We can never know absolute reality. But our certainties are the certainties of the human species. So the absoluteness of our knowledge is limited to the absoluteness of the human species. And the scope is also limited in terms of where our senses can go and how much our mind can process. So this is a limit that he put in. Now, when we look at the concept of the subject and the object, the same thing comes up here. That if I am looking at the object outside, I cannot know what it is except through a psychological process. Therefore, the same thing would apply to internal objects also. Suppose I create an object in my fantasy which does not exist in the outside world. Then the question of sensation and perception would not arise because it's an inwardly created object. I'm not using my eyes to know what is outside. I'm creating an object in fantasy. But that object creation uses from memory some object characteristics of a real object outside. So the outcome of sensation and perception of some other process is being used in this process. And therefore, the limits which are applicable to outside objects also are applicable to the inside objects. Then comes the third part of how far can we go with respect to the pre-verbal objects. What about the psychological objects which are pre-verbal, before language begins? So after language happens, can we really know what happened before language began? Or is it a distinct class of experience which cannot be translated into language? So different people have different beliefs. Some say what was experienced in pre-verbal phase can completely be translated into a verbal phase. Some people say it just cannot be translated, and some people say it can partly be and partly not be. I think we'll have to differentiate here between knowing, recollecting, and a full experience. So with regard to knowing and substantial recollection of experience, it is possible, but full experience is not possible because the advent of language has changed the apparatus forever. And with the apparatus being changed, there is no way a changed apparatus can behave as though it was before the change. So that there are limits about those particular objects which are pre-verbal. And then comes another interesting area of applying thought to oneself. How far can we know ourselves? And there again we have two situations. A knowing observer observing the rest of us, where you still have a subject-object situation. That an observer and a knower is observing the rest of us like an object. So we have split ourselves into two. We have taken out a knower observer and rest of us becomes object, including our bodies, our thoughts, our emotions, everything. So it is still a subject-object situation. However, when this observer tries to know itself, a new situation is created. And there the limits come out that you cannot treat this internally as a subject-object. The way of knowing changes. Instead of knowing through a subject-object situation, this when it tries to know itself, it is knowing by a kind of a process which is auto-knowing, self-revelation. And this brings out a different kind of knowing. That one knowing is the classical subject-object knowing. The second kind of knowing is a self-knowing, and we don't know to what extent this self-knowing and self-revelation is possible. We might be encountering an unknowable there also. We don't know about it. And the third is people talk of knowledge by identity. That we don't know anything empirically about something, but we just look at it and keep thinking about it, and over a period of time we get some knowledge about it. And there the subject-object relationship is very different. The subject covers up the object with his consciousness with an intention to know, and the object by itself reveals in an intuitive way to the subject without the aid of any scientific instrument or empirical process. This is a transfer of knowledge, a transfer of consciousness in a self-revealing mode by the object to the subject, and which is called the knowledge by identity. And a shade of this happens in projective identification, where if we look at the therapist as the subject and the patient as an object, then the patient transfers to the subject knowledge about himself by identification. So these are all the situations where different forms of subject-object relationships come up in the context of knowing. And in all those situations, there are limits of what can be done and cannot be done. And there is a scope of positively doing something.
Himanshu, part of this question we have covered earlier, but I would still repeat the question. How does Indian spirituality look at the subject-object aspects of the psyche?
In one sense, it looks exactly like the Western worldview looks at, that there is a subject and there is an object in a normal sense of the term in everyday experience. However, from a spiritual point of view, it brings in the idea of the Purusha and the Prakriti, where the Purusha is self-awareness and bliss. It's basically self-awareness, and the rest of the self becomes Prakriti and becomes the object. So the Purusha becomes the subject and the Prakriti becomes the object, and the Prakriti includes parts of ourself, our body, our emotions, our thoughts. And then the East also looks at a state of no object where there is a state of no thought. And then it also looks at the state of no subject when there is a unity, oceanic oneness with existence. And the East also looks at internalization of various objects which have their own psychotherapeutic and psychospiritual value by creating personas of gods and goddesses, idols, and so on. In abstract formations, you also have yantras, which are over a period of time made to acquire a human persona. And then the relationship between the subject and that thing starts, that object starts. And then the whole subject-object dynamic goes on.
How important is innovation in this area? And also how traditional knowledge and holistic healing also help in this area?
I think we don't know much about this area, and a lot of innovation is required. Some of the areas which require innovation are this. One, what is the manufacturing process of the object? So if I see something for the first time and a representation develops in my mind, and then I have to load it with thoughts and feelings, how does that process come about? How do we understand why a good, reliable, stable object is so important? What does it do to the rest of the psyche? How can we accelerate or make easy the internalization of good, reliable, stable object? How do we let go of the bad objects that we are not able to let go? How do we classify the objects? Because a good, reliable, stable object of the childhood and a good friend that you meet at 45 years of age are very different things. The objects are heterogeneous. So how do we classify objects in what way? How do we also recognize which objects are beneficial in what way and which objects are malevolent in what way? So this whole classification, understanding, knowing of the characteristics, this whole sort of a periodic table of the internal world of objects, that remains to be created. We don't have any clue about it much. We only have generalities, some of them clinically proven, but still we are at a very macro level. We are not really strong at the micro when we look at the subject-object world. And then we have to bring together epistemology from philosophy to psychoanalysis to know, one, how at different levels processing happens. Because today we confuse different kinds of thought under the label of thought. For example, if somebody has a obsession because of an unresolved Oedipus, the obsessive thought is a thought, and the thoughts in the Oedipus where he is fixated also are thoughts, but there are different types of thoughts. Similarly, when in the Oedipus he got fixated, it was because of an evaluation process which happened, as a result of which the Oedipus happened. There were thoughts in the evaluation process itself. These also are thoughts. So we are looking at three different types of thoughts: the symptom thoughts, the causal phenomena trapped thoughts, and the causal phenomena generating thoughts. Similarly, objects also can be there at all the three levels. Subject also would have behaved differently at all the three levels of the developmental process. All this is yet to be really resolved and studied, so a lot of innovation is needed here. We also need technological innovation apart from holistic healing and traditional healing. We have to mix the holistic, the traditional, and the techno together to address this subject-object issues. For example, can we really design computer games which can facilitate internalization of a good, reliable, stable object? Can we really have computer games or some sort of a techno innovation which allow what is called gradual desensitization? So for every CBT tool, for every psychoanalytic explanation, we can have a techno tool to see how far it can be used to heal, and naturally we'll start with the crude and keep refining the tool to greater efficacy. So this entire area needs a lot of work, and I personally feel in the East, holistic healing techniques like Reiki and pranic healing can be used once we have micro knowledge of this process to micro focus on phenomena or objects, especially using the crystal form, crystal healing form. Lastly, the entire area of visualization and idol therapy and what used to be called in Tantra as Avishkar, those things have to be really brought in to address this whole issue of subject-object dynamics, and where the difficulties lead to pathology and healing, and where issues which are roadblocks on the path of self-development and spiritual progress exist.
Thank you, Himanshuji. We have covered all the questions very well, and there's a lot of clarity on this very interesting subject. Do wait for more such videos on such very interesting topics. And meanwhile, you can write to us at hvindia@gmail.com. Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste.